Angie Cruz and James Hannaham. Angie is the author of 4 novels, including most recently How Not to Drown in a Glass of Water. She teaches at the University of Pittsburgh and is the editor of Asterisks magazine. How Not to Drown in a Glass of Water focuses on a heroine named Cara Romero, who is narrating her story in a series of basically job training interviews, practice, job counseling, to a woman in New York City. She's been out of work for a little while, drawing unemployment, and that's about to run out. And in order to extend the unemployment, she needs to go through this program where she's basically getting job counseling for 12 weeks, 12 sessions. And she is a very voluble, gregarious subject in these interviews, and kind of pours out her whole life story over the course of the interviews. Treats it basically as like a therapy session. That's the premise, the setup of the book. James Hannaham is the author of 3 novels and
a multi-genre book that they can't figure out where to file in any bookstore.
About kind of airplane travel.
It's a series of responses to poems by Fernando Pessoa and an exploration of air disasters.
Okay. We are here. We can explore that if you want. But we're here to talk about his latest novel, his 3rd novel, Didn't Nobody Give a Shit What Happened to Carlotta? Carlotta, thank you. Which centers on a woman named Carlotta. What is Carlotta?
Carlotta Mercedes.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course, Carlotta Mercedes, who takes her, she's born Dustin Campbell.
Chambers,
thank you. She is sent to prison in her late teens, early 20s?
Early 20s.
Early 22.
Yeah. I feel like this is like a game show.
She's now 44. She transitioned while she was
while in prison.
To Carlotta Mercedes. Taking the name.
She took the name of Carlotta Mercedes McCambridge, who is known as Mercedes McCambridge, the actress who was, among other things, a great radio actress and the voice of Pazuzu in The Exorcist.
And now she's up for parole at the beginning of the novel. She's granted parole and is going home for the 4th of July weekend.
Well, she's going home supposedly for, she's going home.
Yeah, but it's set over the 4th of July weekend.
Yes, that's correct.
And she's going home to Brooklyn and moving back in with family and hoping very much to reunite with the son that she hasn't seen since he was about 5 years old. Okay. The theme of this panel, supposedly, is new starts, picking up at midlife, changing, starting over again in midlife. And both books have that in common, and we can talk about that. If I didn't say so, Cara Romero is 55, as it's a job counseling for seniors, and so she's qualified on that basis. But the books have a lot in common besides the starting over at midlife. They are both New York novels, Brooklyn and Washington Heights. They are both novels that are immersed in questions of class and family and gentrification. They both have lively first-person narrators, or in Carlotta's case, a narrator who kind of slips back and forth between first and third person in a way that maybe echoes her shifting identity. Another thing that they have in common is the fact that they both draw a lot of emotional impact from the desire to reconcile with an estranged son. Cara also has an estranged son. And there's like a weird mirror image thing going on where Cara's estrangement is because she judges her son for his sexuality and the way he's lived his life. And in Carlotta's case, her son judges her for her sexuality, gender presentation, and how she's lived her life. And so we can talk about that too. But let's start with this idea of new changes, because in both cases, they're not really changes by choice. They're changes by circumstances visiting on them. And there's almost a resistance to change. You're not sure how much Kara wants a job, but she turns down almost every opportunity that comes her way. And Carlotta's not even sure that she wants to be paroled. She's in a relationship in prison.
Well, that's what she says.
And there's a lot in the book about freedom, what it means to be free on the outside. So I wonder, for both of you, as you wrote your ways into this book, how much do you see them as books about change at midlife, or as opposed to trying to reconcile with past selves and kind of to resist changing at midlife?
No, Turkey, go for it.
Carlotta, she's no. I mean, it's funny. I hadn't thought of this book in those terms really so much at all, except that. I mean, this is. It's not like a midlife crisis for Carlotta. She's not suddenly like, I'm out of prison. I'm going to get a red sports car and a young boyfriend. It's something she has. Although she has mixed feelings about it, they're not that mixed. Except that she's started a relationship in prison, and she's still sort of pining for this person that she's had to leave because she's on parole. So there's a little bit of, there's a pull backward toward the situation that she's more familiar with, but there's also this, before her is the potential for freedom and just the life that she's wanted to live, as opposed to this living hell she's been subjected to for 20-something years.
She's spent years and years of her sentence in solitary.
Right.
And she's been...
For her own protection, as they say.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, who wouldn't want a new start after that? But that's really the context in which... And she's also older by the time she gets out. And a lot of time has passed between... sort of the time when Brooklyn was, when Fort Greene in particular was considered a dangerous black neighborhood, to the time when, like now, when it's considered, I guess, affluent, mostly white now, I think.
There's a lot of that.
And literary capital of the United States. What? I mean, my experience with the neighborhood is really deep. My grandparents bought a brownstone there in the 50s, and I have cousins who still live in that building. And so I have witnessed this 50 some odd years of change to the neighborhood, and especially, and I live there now. And so the last several years have just been like, what the hell is going on in this place? Like, you could go to, actually one of my favorite things to have done as part of the research for the book is I went onto Google Maps, and I looked at the neighborhood, and there's always a lag in the photography, and I looked, and I was like, none of these buildings were here 2 years ago. It was crazy. Austin's having a similar kind of boom right now, building-wise, but this was just out of control.
How about Kara? How much is she hoping to change?
I mean, it's so funny because I'm so glad our books were brought together. I mean, we're both dealing with gentrification, right? Even though it's not like this is about gentrification, it feels like we're both dealing with it.
It's like our books could go on the A train
yes.
to one another.
But it does have to do with these women that are basically like being forced to change through their circumstances, right? But I think, like, for me, the interesting aspect of change for someone like Cara Romero, like the most obvious is, she was working in the same factory for 26 years, and then she was laid off. And she became part of this huge demographic during the Great Recession of women over 55 who lost their jobs, had stable income for pretty much a lot of their time in the United States, and then they were left with no income or possibility. And from my research, many of the women in my community never were able to obtain long-term employment, right? So the fact is they go from stability, community at work, like the communities at work that they developed were really strong. They were a network of resources as well, right? Like if you're working in the same job with the same people, you suddenly become like a family. You're cooking for each other, you're minding each other, you're like helping each other through the processes of life and the documents that they had to move through to get social welfare and all these different things for their extended families. So change was forced on them. And then they had to reckon with like this new world, right? What? Technology? What? I need to use English now? Like, what? Job interview? But the big change for me, and I guess like this is maybe like, you start a novel one way, thinking this is what the novel's gonna be about, this is I'm going to be writing about the Great Recession. What I realized at the end of it, after working on the novel for a number of years, is that the big transformation comes from storytelling. Giving Cara Romero these 12 sessions through the senior workforce program allowed her to change because she finally could make some connections through storytelling about why her son might have left. Right? There's a lot of denial and estrangement in the ways that we push family away or the miscommunications we have with each other that a lot of times happen because we don't spend time thinking about it or reckoning with it. So the senior workforce program becomes kind of like a therapy, like the ways that therapy could also help people connect, map their lives, and sort of think, oh wait, I could have done that differently. Maybe I'm not treating my sister that well. Maybe I have more in common with this person. And if I would say like transformation, I think, besides the obvious, which is new job, a new world, new challenges, it's also like like giving people space to tell their story and being exquisite listeners to people, like really listening. I feel like a lot of people are not listening to each other. We project our fantasies on everybody, And for efficiency's sake, right? Because if I know who you are, I don't have to spend that much time getting to know you. But if you actually stop, which is what this program forces to do, and she has an exquisite listener, which is the reader, by the way, and also the interviewer, then maybe transformation can actually happen. Yeah.
I'm going to return to that in a bit because there's a pivotal scene where I think that we see that. But first, James, a quick description of your book might lead readers to think that, the big change here is that Carlotta went into prison as a man and is coming out as a woman, and that's the change that she's dealing with now at 44 and coming out. But in fact, she's been a woman for decades. So for her, that's no change at all. It's a change for her family. They've been aware of it, but kind of pushed it aside. They've been able to ignore it. She's been away. For her, that's not the change. The change for her is leaving prison and entering the real world. There's that great line about re-entry is a word that we use both for ex-cons and for astronauts. And it's like, that's how alien the world that she's re-entering is. And so I wonder how much you conceived of this as a book about the prison system and re-entry, kind of about the prison system and re-entry.
Well, the snowball started this way. I wanted to write about the change that happened in Brooklyn over the 50 years that I'm actually older than that, but from the time that I went to, it was so supposedly dangerous. It was just where my grandmother lived for most of my childhood. And I didn't really think of it as a dangerous neighborhood, but apparently, I heard people talking about it later and like, you don't go to Fort Greene. And I was like, oh, really? You don't? But my grandmother lives there. So I wanted to write about that as somebody who had sort of come back. Although I didn't live there, I started to live there later. And I had seen all of this happen, and I was like, "This is messed up," like in any number of ways. And that's what I wanted to write about. But I needed a character who for whom it would be really jarring, for whom it would be just like earth-shatteringly messed up. And I thought, well, how about somebody who was in prison and just didn't see any of what happened? Or saw some of it at a remove that was kind of like a hazy, gauzy, like people in prison do try to keep up with the times, but it's like a separate job apparently.
Everything's
for doing
that.
that.
The
Yeah.
cars that start with the keys or that beep when you get into them. She's like,
Right.
What is this?
Yeah, subway tokens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The
Oh,
Metro
excuse me.
card.
Like she's still looking for a subway token. I should say she doesn't know that a Metro card is a thing. So I mean, but the one thing that hasn't changed is the C train.
Yes. Including the people on it.
Right. Yeah, that was a funny thing to notice. So there was that, and then what else happened? And I thought that it should be somebody who was coming back from prison, and I was thinking about like my own potential subject position as a person in prison, as an openly gay man, and then I was like, well, maybe people who are trans would have an even worse time of it. And then this voice showed up in my head, and it said, "Bitch, you gonna make me the star of your book." And I said,
It's a remarkable voice.
I know, I feel like it's one that's been in the back of my head for quite a long time. And I think that's actually one of the weird things about the way people ask me about the book. It's like, actually, that part was not the hard part, because the voice comes fairly naturally to me. I think partially because it's one of those sort of truth-telling, voices that will read everybody. And I'm not really that kind of person, but I do have those thoughts. And so the book is a little like, the character is a little way of like, channeling those thoughts into a good thing rather than, reading everybody and tearing people down and being shady.
I mean, in some ways, both Carlotta and Cara are like super sweet, well-meaning, just they
Optimistic.
Optimistic, hopeful people, but also their own worst enemies. They're kind of chaotic and get in their own way a lot. And
They're called fictional characters. No, seriously, that is what you want out of a fictional character, right? You don't want somebody who's just like stable guy who nothing happens to. You don't get to know somebody. You don't get to know what they're made of unless they make odd choices or, just do something crazy once in a while or get into a scrape. Like that's what keeps us interested in fictional characters, I think.
Yeah. And partly because we are so in their heads for both of these books, we're on their side through it all. It's like, yes, cause the chaos, but stir it all up.
Because we are them.
When I say that there's a scene late in the book, this kind of that shifts things for Cara, the scene I'm thinking of, you can probably guess, is the fight with her sister. Oh. It's where her sister. It shakes the rightness of Cara's position. We've been on her side all along. We've seen things from her point of view, and she has this big confrontation in the hallway with her sister, who says, "Here's the way things are, and here's the way you're just like Mom was, and here are all these problems about you." And it's things that Cara has not seen about herself, and therefore we have not seen about Cara. And suddenly you think, maybe there's something to all this. And I think Cara thinks maybe there's something to all this. And I don't want to make too much of this, but the sister's name is Angela, and you are Angie. And so I wonder, in that scene, whose side are you on?
I never made that connection, and now I want to go home. No, it's funny, that scene. So, as you were saying, James, it's like we want to create these characters that have full of contradiction, right? Because they make the most interesting stories, right? And we are full of contradictions. If we're really honest, we're all kind of really messy, right? We're all messy. And we get it wrong a lot of the time. We just know how to hide it, the good the good ones, right? Like know how to hide the wrong. And I feel like in a novel, you see all the bad and all the good and all the beautiful and all the infuriating and aspects of Kara. And of course, when you have a character, like I always think of other characters, basically are the questions the reader's asking. But wait, could I really trust Kara? Could I really trust this narrator? And of course you can't. She's totally unreliable. So Angela, in some ways, works against her. So when I had to build the book, and I was like, I really need someone to confront Kara, I chose Angela. Yeah. I didn't choose the son. I didn't choose any of these other characters that it could have been. I chose Angela because in the end, the book is really about mothering and how we mother. And the choices, like anyone who's a mother understands how many times one feels we're doing it wrong. Right? Like even if you try to do everything right, and these women are mothering in very different ways and come from a very complicated mother as well, right? And they inherited this story of their mother, and they're trying to repair in their way with their own children. So bringing them together in that fight for me was really fun, actually. Like, it's not like, oh, this is Angela. I'm Kara too, and I'm also Angela, and I'm like every person in this character in this book. But I want to bring up something totally not connected because, like, so what, right? I'm full of digressions. When I wrote that scene, I was very manic in the last few weeks of working on the novel. I had to submit it, and my son wanted to spend time with me. He was 14 years old, and I was like, I can't spend time with you. All I could do is think about this book right now. I need to get it in. And I was reading it out loud constantly because it's written in a monologue form. And that's how I was trying to get the voice right. I kept reading it out loud. So he would sit on the sofa and listen. And when I got to this scene, I was just like so frustrated. He goes, "What's wrong, Mom?" I was like, "I don't know. It's like they're fighting and something has to happen and they're not getting along." He goes, "Is it like the Joker and Batman?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" He goes, "You know what's great about them? They need each other, even though they hate each other, so they're not going to kill each other." And he shows me this clip from on YouTube of Batman and Joker. And this is when they could really end the fight forever. But instead of ending each other, they start laughing. And I was like, I'm going to do that for them too. And it was so right.
Yeah.
It felt so right. So while this has nothing to do with what you asked, I think it's a great story.
I asked about the scene.
But I bring it up because I do think that there's a way that I also feel like in the book, part of my transformation in working on this book is that for so much of my career, I kept thinking I have to be alone in a room with my candle and my tea, and no one could distract me to write a good book. And this book, I was like, I can't be alone. It's pandemic. I have a kid in my house all day long. I have my family coming in and out. Like, I'm gonna have to figure out how to really bring my community in the process of writing. And that really informed the book.
Yeah.
Is that there were just a lot of people around me all the time.
That's great. Both of these books seem to me to have clear literary models. For Didn't Nobody Give a Shit What Happened to Carlotta, I think there's some Invisible Man in there. I think there's certainly Ulysses in there.
There's a lot.
And in How Not to Drown in a Glass of Water, I'd almost say Portnoy's Complaint, just the whole format of kind of pouring out your story to a receptive listener. It feels like that. But just because I see that doesn't mean it's true. And so I want to know if it's true, and whether, if so or if not, what books did inform these books? What were you thinking about as you were writing them? You say, yes, there's so much in there of other influences.
All right.
And how much did that kind of influence as you were writing, and how much was it just like a kind of a signpost along the way?
All right. Well, what happened was I had started writing a book about somebody coming back from, traumatic events in upstate New York. And I realized from having visited upstate New York that if you're telling a story about someone coming back from traumatic events in upstate New York, right? You're coming back from Ithaca, for example. You are retelling the Odyssey by necessity, right? And that's because there's this central New York military tract is a bunch of pieces of land that was owned by someone else that after the Revolutionary War was parceled out to soldiers who had been in the war. And there was this one guy in the office that was, his name was Robert Harper. He was responsible for naming a lot of the townships and municipalities, and he was a classical buff. He was a classical literature buff. And so he named a lot of things in upstate New York for classical things. I mean, Troy, Ithaca. I mean, I think not only did he do it, I think it started to catch on as a thing that was separate from the central New York military tract. So I realized that, I should probably fold that in somehow. But then after that, my second thought was like, everyone's done that. That's like the most tired thing you could do. And at that point, I think it was around June of 2016. My husband, who is of Irish descent, Irish American, he's Irish American, but his grandparents on one side were from Ireland, and he still used to go there for the summers, and he'd been there a bunch of times, and he took me there. And I usually, when we go to a different country, I take a work of literature that's representative in some way. And so I brought Ulysses, which, everybody in Ireland was like, don't read that. I've never read that. It's awful. But I realized that there were a lot of points of connection between what I wanted to do and what was in the book, and I started to think of like each of the books, my book and Joyce's and Homer's, as like panes of glass, and like you could take this book and like look through it to get to all the rest of it. And so structurally is really where things started to get interesting for me. There's a lot of structure, and a lot of the sort of setups in the book have either were inspired by something in the Odyssey, in Ulysses, or both, or were retrofitted to do so. And
down to the last word.
the last chapter is a gloss on the Molly Bloom chapter.
Sure.
That's entirely in Carlotta's voice, but it's meant to kind of I don't know, I don't want to say it. It's meant to be a kind of rip-off. That's, I guess, the best way to say it. And there are lots of other things that I noticed sort of they like eerie kinds of sense. Like there's a drug in the Odyssey called Molly, Moly, yeah. And that this is a drug that is a street drug. Now I think it's Molly.
Carlotta takes it.
Yeah, and yeah. That Carlotta ends up taking while in prison to sort of numb the pain. That was that, but that's one of only a bunch of different things that I happened to notice in both of the texts that were like, okay, so when Odysseus comes back from Troy, he disguises himself, and nobody recognizes him. And I thought, well, that's kind of stupid, actually, as a thing. It's like it's a very theatrical kind of thing. Like nobody's gonna like. But in Carlotta's case, it seemed to work that she had changed her appearance enough that there were people that would not recognize her,
and random people who do.
Right.
Also.
Right. That's exactly. Yeah. But I mean, it goes on from there. But then there's also Chester Himes. There's a book called Yesterday Will Make You Cry that's about a tender relationship that takes place between two men in prison. That it actually it's a sort of, what do you call it, like the director's cut of his first novel that was reissued after, I don't know exactly what, I'm not sure if it was after he died. I think it was after he died, though. Probably somebody knows.
How about you, Angie? Is there port noise complaint in here at all? And also, I'd love to hear you in talking about kind of guidelines or guideposts that you took for the book to talk about it's not just her conversations with the counselor. Each of those conversations is intercut with documentation, with her job applications, with like an evaluation saying, here are your strengths, things that you might be good at, and talking about the role that plays in the book.
You know, I'm going to have fun with this one because the honest truth is that I went back to the professional storytellers of my life, which was my grandmother. I ended up, thank God, for a pandemic. This was one of the pandemic gifts, spending time with her. I hadn't spent a lot of time with her in 12 years because I was teaching in Texas and then Pittsburgh. And the pandemic forced me back into New York to be with I kind of was like, I need to spend time with all the elders. Because I really felt like we didn't have a lot of time, you know? And, you know, my grandmother's an incredible storyteller. And I started to realize how much I learned from her on how to tell story, but it wasn't really validated ever when I was a student, as an MFA student. And I tried so hard to kind of like intellectualize stories in a way, like, oh, let me talk about how this influenced my work, and how does a scene work, and these are the rules, and let me tell you about the mechanics of fiction. And when I worked on this book, I thought I was never going to write again. I actually started this book in 2017. I was feeling a lot of despair because Trump was president. I couldn't sell my book Dominicana. It had gone through hundreds of rejections from all kinds of publishers. They said there was no market for my book. And I was like, what am I going to do? I had to get my book in contract to be tenured, or else I was going to lose my job. I was a single mom. And I was like, okay, what else can I do? I was like, I'm going to become an immigrant lawyer and help all these immigrants that Trump has us under attack at the moment. And I was on the subway in New York City, and I saw this woman, and she was reading some kind of handbook, like an ESL manual. And I was like, what would it look like for her to start over? Here I am thinking about starting over, and then I started thinking about the women that I knew had to start over in 2008. And just like you, that voice came, and it didn't shut up. Cara Romero said, you want me to tell you something about myself? I'll tell you something about myself. I came to this country because my husband wanted to kill me. Don't look so shocked. And I pulled out my phone, Google Doc, and I wrote the first section of the book. I mean, it changed a lot since then. On that train ride, it was a 40-minute train ride. And I said, okay, maybe I'll never write again, but I'm going to write this for me, not thinking it would be a novel. And every time I got on a subway, I had a constraint, subway, planes, and buses. I would answer a question. I would ask Cara Romero a question, and she answered it. And the book developed that. And I said, you know, I'm going to digress. I'm going to stay off topic. Meanwhile, I was listening to stories that I fell in love with as a writer, as a young writer. I listened to Toni Morrison read Sula, you know what I mean, on audiobook. I was listening to Vivian Gornick. Oh my God, like I think deeply influenced by the way she talks about the building and fierce attachment.
Mother-child story.
Another mother-child story. I was listening to Jamaica Kincaid, and I was just like trying to fall in love with literature again and getting, you know, it's my fourth book. It's like being married for a long time. You know what I mean? Like, it could be hard. And I had to sort of fall in love and understand why I fell in love with telling stories. And spending time with my grandmother, who is a very complicated figure, very different than Cara, but the way that she could spin a story so you never leave the house, like, it's like I go in to drop something off, and she's like, no, siéntate. Let me tell you what happened to the neighbor. And then suddenly I'm there for 2 hours, and I'm like, how did she do that? How did she do that? Taking notes, you know, taking notes. And that it's okay to digress, and it's okay to spin out of the plot. And it's okay to let one of those plots go and not tie everything up again. We forget that when we're training and teaching, I think. And this is where my influence is.
I feel like
I know, you're like great.
I feel like didn't Gabriel Garcia Marquez say a similar thing about 100 Years of Solitude?
Oh, yeah.
That he just was like threw all the rules out and he was like, I'm going to tell a story like my grandmother.
Yes. Yeah, but I did forget it. You know, I forgot it because I was so busy trying to get this book published and revising it so I can get tenure. And then in the end, I was like, forget everybody. The book ended up publishing. It did really well. The market knows nothing, but
I could keep asking questions, but we have under 10 minutes left, and I wanted to open it up to the audience in case they had any questions. Let's spend the last little bit doing that, unless nobody does have any. Are there questions from the audience?
There's usually an awkward silence here.
Yeah.
And then one brave soul.
I mostly spend my time with musicians. Are all literary panels this much fun?
Yes.
Tip for you, James, about, was it Carlotta's brother or was it her nephew that was in the room with the video game in the dark?
Her brother.
Her brother? So,
This is a character who's morbidly obese.
morbidly obese and agoraphobic, a little.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
But he was in a prison of his own creating somewhat.
Mm-hmm.
And Carlotta just didn't know what to do with that. And did you do it that way, or is that just how?
I mean, there are a lot of ways in which I was trying in the book to show the ways in which people who have freedom are actually imprisoning themselves in various ways, right? Like this, being constantly on the phone, or just like being distracted by things that are not real. And Leon, I have this character named Leon, who is sort of a little bit like Carlotta's brother, who's well, I don't really want to talk about Leon, but yeah, I was thinking of him as somebody who was imprisoning himself because the world outside is so hostile to people of his physical stature, with his physical attributes, right? Like he's a big, corpulent black man, and he's like, they're going to shoot you in the street. They're going to, like he's like paranoid, although, show me a paranoid black person and I'll show you a black person who's alive. But he's like, he just doesn't want to go out there because like people are going to treat him badly. And I think he has some good reasons to want to stay in, but I think ultimately that decision is kind of, self-defeating and horrible.
Angie, we get the story through these 12 sessions, and maybe I was just thinking a little bit too much about it, but were we supposed to think that they were taken down verbatim, that the story is being told to this social worker, or are we to think that we got the highlights from the 12 sessions? Like, did you think about the social worker at all and what she was taking down when you wrote it?
I mean, yeah. I mean, I did see the social worker as the audience, but as, in the audience, we have this wonderful writer, Clevis Natera, who is the author of Neruda in the Park, and we just did a talk recently in Pittsburgh, and she says something about how the other half of the book is the reader who is sitting in the place of the interviewer. And, I mean, is it verbatim? I do like constraints. I feel like there's a lot of freedom when I create some constraints in the writing. And being that she is a character that has a lot to say, I decided that each session would be within less than 30 minutes, like 20, they're all about 25 to 30 minutes each. So obviously, like, it's like you're listening to someone speak for that long. Yeah.
Yes, I haven't read either book yet, but I'm excited.
Just buy them.
Based on your conversation, and this is still from my own obsessions, with the idea of the archive and the state, was that idea of using either documents or thinking about the ways in which the state, right, and I use that term sort of in like the big, right, influences in particular, right, brown and black bodies, and how that sort of affects the way in which we move and live and think and even tell stories, our own stories in the world, and like, was that at all part of what you were thinking, or just kind of happened, right? I know what you're saying, there's documents or these questionnaires and things, right? And how so much of that paperwork and that documentation and those legal items dictate so much of and impose their power over, in particular, so many marginalized communities. So I just want to hear if there's, well, you're working with that.
I mean, I feel like that's the heart of what I'm getting at, right? Is that I think this is why it's kind of hard for me, because it gets really emotional for me right here. Is like, the feeling of being in opposition to your society in any number of ways is very hard. But I feel like it's kind of my mission in a lot of ways to like illuminate what that feels like. Not just for my own life, but like for other people's. And I think it comes very naturally to me, because I think I'm somebody who's like, I've had a certain number of advantages, right, which are not privileges. Because privilege to me is like somebody, like if I could walk down the street with a television over my arm in a white neighborhood and nobody bothered me, that's privilege. Advantages are like things my mother did to make sure that I am still alive. And I knew they were privileges, and I knew that they were advantages, and I did not squander them, right? So I feel like I'm in a certain position to be able to like use that to say something to people who might not know what that's like. All right, anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think the state and all these things, but it's true that I believe in a lot of things I'm saying, right? And when people read the book and they're like, oh, you're critiquing the government, you're critiquing the system and bureaucracy, and, and how it's really like keeping people from getting the things they say they want to give them. It's in there, right? Because as writers, it's like an embodied experience. It comes out in the work. But, I'm kind of like a method writer in the way that I actually, to try to go through the processes with the character. So I would actually go into the system and see the questions and sort of think, what would Cara Romero say? And when I used to do it as a kid, I was the main translator in my family. So, and I remember, like, some of these things are impossible to answer. And you're like, should I tell the truth or should I work around the system? Or like, my mother's maiden name, like date of birth, questionable. Like, it's just, so, and I decided to have fun with it, right? And again, like, I wrote this book, like, it was so much fun to write, even though it was a difficult book, because I really didn't think it was ever going to get published. And I think that's a great advice for anyone who is trying to write a book, because I forgot. I was like, you know what? No one's going to care about this but me. I'm writing it for me. And I needed to laugh so badly during those years. And the system is messed up. Right?
Anybody else? Yes.
No questions. Just thank you very much for your time. I haven't read either of those books, but I
Just buy it. Good. Buy another.
I also want to say, James, one of the books that I read in 2015, I still think about today, Delicious Foods. I have recommended that book to more people than any other book, and so I'm very much excited to next week take yours and just lock myself in my room.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Angie.